Hello, welcome back. Today we are going to talk about the A7 Mark IV. I normally don't make videos like this, and I don't really want to talk about the leaks, but kind of give my technical guesses on what I think will happen. Because I think I made this video about 4 years ago, probably 3 years ago, about when the A9 came out, that I predicted what the R4 would be. So basically this camera, the R4, 61 megapixels. And I was totally wrong because I predicted that they would put a stacked sensor in there. I had to wait until the A1 came out to basically make my dreams come true. I made a video, and sometimes I even get remarks still on it. They're like, yeah, you were way off, etc, etc. In a way, the camera did show up. It was just a few years late. But I do think there's something interesting about the current rumors that I quickly want to talk about and provide an alternative based on what I think the technology can do and what Sony could do if they want to impress us. And what I mean with impress us, we have to remember that the A7 III is probably the most important camera of the last decade. The A9 was a very important sort of threshold, and even the A1 is again, let's say, an interesting jump into what we think and we thought was possible. And if Sony really wants to make an impression, I don't understand the leaks, because they are talking about 32 megapixels, a number that I don't really understand, and 5.5 stops of IBIS, which is what all the cameras currently are already doing in the new generation of the Sony, including this one and the S3. So also don't understand that. So what I want to do is talk about an alternative path that Sony could take and maybe could shock us with. So here we go. Let's the short thing. I think what they could do is drop the mechanical shutter completely. This won't be the first camera that does it. There's already a Sigma camera that does it. But I think if you look at the numbers, it actually kind of makes sense. Let me walk you through this, what I think what could happen. I think the camera will indeed be introduced at $2,500. I think it makes sense. All the other brands are going up a little bit in price. So instead of the $2,000, they will start at $2,500 and slowly bring it back into price. I'm not sure what the introduction price of the M3 was. I think it was $2,000, but I'm not fully sure. But let's assume that 2,500 is a number that I would also suspect. That means they have about $500 to play with. Now, the first thing that I suggest is that they will copy many of the technologies of this camera or its brothers, right? So the S3, the R4 and the A1 are all using kind of the same body. We can talk about the details, and one has a flippy screen, but just this part, back part. This part on the A1 is a little bit thicker. On the A9 it's a little bit in between. On the R4 it's kind of the same body and also. So I think they will reuse the body. I think they will reuse the chipset. I think they will maybe underclock it, and the underclocking also means that it will have less heat. So I think that the back panel of all the higher models, so the R4, the A1, the A9, they all have a fully magnesium back body. The M3 has a plastic sort of back body, so you can also feel it a little bit. I think they could do that again, but it means that there will be less heat dissipation, and that could be solved by lowering the CPUs a little bit, things like that. I think it will drop a few ports, so I do think it will keep the same cards, so the two Express A cards. Again, about reuse. Same with the motherboard. I think they will use actually the same motherboard as inside here, because some parts like the flash sync port and the Ethernet port is probably on a separate motherboard again. It was like that before, so they don't have to plug that in. They would just have these fake holes sort of over here, which we also saw on previous cameras. So I think they can slim it down and then remove the shutter completely. And if they remove the shutter completely, next to the sensor, they tell me that's the most expensive part in the camera. We know that the A7 III always has problems with its shutter. Why not remove it completely? Now, of course, this may sound silly until you think about what this A1 sort of shows you. It shows you that Sony has control over basically all the weak points that needed to be resolved. The first one, of course, if they go to a 24 I suggest 24 megapixels stacked sensor, rolling shutter. Right, rolling shutter is basically eliminated. That means that silent shooting is now the same quality as mechanical shooting, almost no downside. The second downside was anti-flicker. You could not do anti-flicker in silent mode on most of these cameras. The A1 is not able to do it, so they have the routines for it. It works perfectly fine to be able to shoot LED lights, and it will automatically adapt also now in electronic shutter mode. So that is gone. The second one is flash sync, right? Now let's look at this camera, and not even the buffer, because that would also be an interesting one. But this, if you use on, let's go to this one. On this one, you can see that I put it in crop mode, which I have it in crop mode now. You can see that the buffer is silly deep, right? Now I'm not saying they will put the same buffer depth in, but you can almost shoot forever and it will be totally fine. And I'm not sure, it's now shooting at 30 frames a second. I don't think they will do that on the Mark IV. They will probably limit it to 12 to 15 frames a second, so below the A9. That makes perfect sense to me. That would mean that there's again less heat, less power requirements are needed. More important, that also means that some of the other demands on the camera will go down, and maybe even on the yield of the sensors and the chips. So what else do we need? We need flash support, right? Now the Sony Mark III has flash support of 1/250. Now this is a 50 megapixel sensor, and in flash mode, it's the first camera that does this. You can sync flash this to 1/200 of a second, so that will be too slow. Would be going backwards. But in crop mode, because it needs to do less of the sensor, it needs to have less data, it can do 1/250. So if they use the same scanning technology on the M4, then they could in fact match what the M3 is already doing. So that's kind of my wild guess what Sony could be thinking if they again want to make a splash, because I don't think that any feature that I've seen so far really impresses anybody. That doesn't mean that it will going to be a bad camera if they release it the way that it is, because compared to, for example, the Nikon Z6, which is 20 megapixels, if it's indeed 32 megapixels, it's a good bump up. It will have all the new features, for example, with the slots, it will have the new menus, etc, etc. I'm not saying it, if they release it what is rumored, it won't be a solid upgrade to the M3. But it won't be a spectacular upgrade. And I think one thing that Sony could do is say, okay, we're going to up the price by 500. We're going to take the shutter out, that saves us some money. We are going to do the same reuse of parts over the last 3 models that we already have, which again brings down the price. And we will use the price of the sensor, let's say the 500 extra in list price, plus maybe 150 euros that they can save on the shutter and the other parts that they don't need anymore, and put that in a 24 megapixel stack sensor. And why would that be shocking? It will be shocking because then for the first time a whole generation of entry-level full frames camera owners will start learning to shoot with a real blackout sort of solution. And I think that is going to be a game changer. I think that is very important. Of course, it will also have lots of other good features. It will be good for video because it would have way less rolling shutter. It has all kinds of follow-up advantages if they do this. And I think it actually makes sense for them to do their most daring step in a way into the Mark IV, because the Mark III, the A7 Mark III, was already, let's say, the shocker of the last decade. And I think they could do this. And that's what I wanted to talk to you about today, because the rumors are, I wouldn't say are a little bit, I think, by the way, they're all coming from one source. So I don't add too much value to the rumors, and now they call them leaks. Well, it's not even a leak, it's a rumor. I think, I'm not saying that my guess is as good as any, but I do think there are some technical reasons why this could be possible now, and you have to wonder why wouldn't Sony go for the kill and basically introduce this way of shooting into the cameras, reduce the amount of physical and mechanical parts inside the camera, and make a platform that can grow into the future by slowly starting to speed it up. Because then I think if the M4 comes without a shutter, then clearly the A9 Mark III will be coming without a shutter, etc, etc, etc. And I think partly the A1 was about that, showcasing that if you tune it down, so if you put it in 21 megapixel mode, which is very close to 24 megapixels, and if you look then at all the features, there's basically no difference between a 24 megapixel camera with shutter or without a mechanical shutter. So yeah, that's what I think that might happen. And most likely in 2 years people will say, yeah, you are totally wrong, you are 2 years off again. But I don't know, maybe it is right. Tell me what you think in the comments. I think from a money point of view, this is doable. And if Sony really wants to yeah, let's say take a jump on Canon, this might be the way to do it. So this is going to be my guess, probably wrong, but it's a guess anyway. Bye bye.